Bullying is a problem in social relationships that we hear a lot about these days, but it doesn't just happen in schools. It can happen in workplaces, it can happen in community organisations, it can happen in sporting clubs, and it can also happen in neighbourhoods and even families. Having said that, most of us will not be seriously damaged by bullying. We will have brushes with it, we'll see other people being bullied, and it may even happen to someone who's quite close to us. But we ourselves will not likely be bullied. Having said that, it's important to realise that, well, it's not our problem, we are an important part of the solution to the problem. So why should we bother about bullying? Why should we try to do something about it? The problem is that bullying can be deeply damaging for those involved. For victims of bullying, for those who become the targets of bullying, it can lead to all sorts of mental health problems. It can lead to anxiety. It can lead to depression. It can also mean that people are afraid to go out. It leads to social withdrawal. And another consequence is that often people can't concentrate well enough to do their work. And this happens to children and to adults alike, that they're put off their work and they lose track of what they're supposed to be doing. And of course that leads to loss of confidence and a feeling that they can't do what they want to do. But even for bullies, being a bully is not a good thing in the long term. People who bully often never learn to control their impulses. They keep on acting in an aggressive and dominating way. And that can be damaging for their social relationships in that they are unable to establish respectful relationships with people in the future. And then we have problems with complications that arise from these bullying incidents. It's not unusual for bullying to arise around perceptions that something very unfair and unjust has happened. And in that situation, other people can be involved. There can be retaliation. There can be bullying moving from face-to-face situations to the internet, and it can get quite out of control. In these situations, we often see the emergence of what we call bully victims. So people are bullying one minute and they're the victims of bullying in the next instance. And when people settle into these patterns of bullying and victimization, they often acquire the problems of both groups. So they become really damaged people from this experience. Also, we have to realize that it's often very, very difficult to get to the bottom of bullying. It becomes complex and everyone has something to complain about in the behaviour of other people. And so for those in charge, it's not an easy task at all. It's much better if we can prevent bullying from happening in the first place. Because of the long-term damage that can occur because of bullying, it's really important that workplaces and schools adopt anti-bullying programs. And there are a lot of them around, and a lot of them are very effective. We know that on average they will reduce bullying by around 20%, which is a pretty good outcome. And if they're implemented really well, you can expect a better success rate than that. When I say you can reduce bullying by 20%, this comes from a big meta-analysis of a number of studies that have been done of different bullying programs, and they've had evaluations attached to them. So these are not necessarily the best programs. They're simply programs that a lot of people use and that have been evaluated. So if we combine the best of all those programs, we would hope to be doing a lot better than 20%. One of the big divisions that we often find in this field of research is between those who want a soft approach, if you like, let's try to make people more empathic, more understanding, let's make people nicer to each other, and those that have what you might call a more conservative law and order approach. Let's have rules, let's have supervision. And I think we need to realise that there's something important and insightful in both those approaches. We need to bring them together. And a lot of bullying programs don't bring them together. It's one or the other, or a preference for one or the other. And I suppose that lines up with the fact that you often have schools that will differ in their approach. You have schools that are more relational, more focused on making sure everyone gets along well together, and you have schools that are more competitive, that are training the leaders of tomorrow, and believe that a bit of competition and toughening everyone up is a good way of going. But neither of those extremes actually prepares people for life very well at all. And neither of those presents a solution to bullying. There needs to be an appreciation of the relational elements to bullying, but also an appreciation of the fact that to live in society, we have to obey the rules. We can challenge them. We can try to change them. That's a good thing to do, and particularly a good thing to do in a democracy. But we can't flagrantly flaunt them, and we particularly can't do that when it's clear that we're doing harm to others. We find that most schools these days will have anti-bullying policies and procedures, but unfortunately the written word often doesn't get put into practice. And so these written policies don't succeed in stopping the bullying. And that's what targets of bullying want more than anything else. They just want the bullying to stop. So how do we do that? And perhaps what I should explain now is, what do I mean by bullying? Let's start with something that I call soft bullying. And let's start there because it's something that we're all familiar. Imagine the situation where you want someone to do something that they don't want to do. That might mean that you want them to do their homework, or you might want someone to give you a lift to a party, or you might want someone to come to the party with you, or you just might want to be left alone. So you persist and insist that the other person does what you want them to do, even though that's not what they want to do. If you persist for too long, they eventually will say to you, "Stop bullying me." Now that's an example of soft bullying. Why is it soft bullying? Because what you'll do is back off. You'll realise that you're pushing too hard. You've invaded that person's personal space too much. You might even apologise. It's these kinds of experiences which have been so important for us all in learning that bullying actually is not a very good way to behave, that we have no right to dominate people too much. We need to respect them and their space. But unfortunately, not everyone learns that lesson, and sometimes the context is such that people forget about that lesson. To understand what real bullying is like, imagine that we do not back off when we see the signs that we're making someone feel uncomfortable. Imagine that we start being sarcastic, that we start telling stories about them, calling them names, teasing them. Let's say we just keep that pressure on, and we don't just keep the pressure on then, we continue it. We might actually give them the silence treatment. We do various things to make them feel very uncomfortable, and we just ignore the signs they're sending us that they feel uncomfortable. This is what happens when we enter the territory of serious bullying. We're not only humiliating someone and intimidating them, but we're not letting them escape. We're keeping that pressure up. And so people who are targeted for bullying become fearful every time they see the particular person who's upset them. They dread the encounter and they rehearse what's going to happen before it happens. And that undermines their well-being and their sense of self-esteem and their confidence in just coping socially. So that's serious bullying. We not only have behaviour that makes people feel humiliated and fearful, it happens repeatedly, often for days and weeks and months on end. And people feel there's absolutely nothing they can do to get out of the situation and to prevent it from happening. Often we make the mistake of thinking that bullying occurs when we have stronger and more powerful people treating their subordinates or less important people in this way. But while that happens very often, it's not the only situation where we encounter bullying. We do find that while teachers will bully students, students will also bully teachers. Students, of course, bully each other. Teachers will bully each other. And then we also have reports of parents who will bully teachers and parents who will feel that they've been bullied by teachers. So when we talk about bullying in schools, there are many ways in which it can happen. And for this reason, it's really important that any intervention is a whole school approach, that it's an approach to bullying or to prevention of bullying that includes teachers, students, and also parents. So what are the common elements in these anti-bullying programs? The first port of call is to set up communication that's respectful, that involves listening to each other, that involves shared problem solving, where people control their anger and their frustrations and realise that others are in a difficult situation like them and will be partners in solving problems. So the very first thing is to develop a sense of empathy for others, and then a whole lot of communication channels that are open to talk about problems as they arise rather than waiting until everyone's quite frustrated and angry with the situation. So that's the first thing that must be done. And it's important that parents and teachers and students are all part of that discussion and that they realise that they're all capable of treating each other in a disrespectful way, and that together they're going to change that pattern of behaviour in a school. But of course we can all decide to treat each other in a respectful way, but doing it can be another thing. So that we need other strategies to help us, if you like, keep to our word. Those other strategies often involve training. So there are training programs for teachers to prevent bullying and to be good role models themselves. And of course, there are lots of programs that help children and students learn to treat each other in a more respectful way. Parents also can be involved in workshops about how the school as a whole is going to prevent bullying and establish its anti-bullying program. And inclusion of all those people becomes critically important if we want a successful outcome. As you can imagine, it's a fragile piece at first in a school that's had bullying problems. And so every effort and everyone has to put their best foot forward to actually get over that first hurdle. It's like breaking all sorts of behaviour patterns that we know are not so good for us. It's not easy to do. And one of the good things about the workshops that can be done is that you can practice scripts of speaking to each other more respectfully, of not blaming, of not stigmatising. I think the difference between criticising someone's behaviour and stigmatising that person is quite a subtle one, and one that many people don't understand and know about. So what I mean is that someone might skip school and you might be very angry with them as a parent for skipping the school. But if you stay on track and simply say, I don't like you missing school, that's not a respectful thing to do and it's not good for you in the future, then you're talking about the behaviour. You're restricting yourself to criticism of the behaviour. That's quite different from saying you're a horrible child and you never do what you're told and you'll make nothing of your life, which is global and makes the child feel unworthy and that their parents have little hope for them. I suppose another way of saying it is that when we stigmatise, we destroy a person's hope that they can ever live up to their ethical identity, where we're criticizing the whole self, if you like, and saying they're worthless. But if we just stick to the particular behaviour that is causing problems at the moment, their ethical identity is intact. In fact, we can even say that's so unlike you to do something that's so damaging to yourself and to others, and your teacher's really upset. Let's go and apologise for this and get things back on track, because I know that you wouldn't mean to do so much harm. So it's a subtle difference, but an important one to understand, and scripts can actually help us get that down off pat, so that even when we're angry, we don't stigmatise. Instead, we criticise the behaviour, disapprove of the behaviour, while respecting, if you like, and expressing hope for that child's ethical identity. And the same, of course, would apply to teachers and principals when they're in a difficult situation and a principal is being critical or disapproving of something that a teacher has done. The longer the duration of the learning process, the better it is. And one way that we can make sure that people don't forget about our new anti-bullying principles is to have people involved as bystanders and as mentors. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're all involved in finding the solutions to bullying problems. And it's as a bystander or as a mentor that we can play an important part in the prevention of bullying. As a bystander, it means that if you see a bullying incident develop, you can actually say, hey, we don't do that sort of thing here. There's no need to bully that person. Or if you don't want to do that, you can simply intervene in the flow of events and change the topic or get people to do other things that distract them so that the situation does not erupt. In many school programs, children are taught to be involved bystanders, to step in and prevent bullying from occurring, and we know this works very well. But it also can occur with teachers. We can help teachers not get involved in a bullying situation by seeing the signs and intervening to help resolve a situation before it erupts. The other thing that's really important is mentoring, and we know this works. Often in schools, younger children who are having difficulties or are simply new to the school are given a mentor, someone that will help ease the way, help them make friends, give them an idea of how they're supposed to behave and what they can do to make their own friends. But equally important is having teachers as mentors for other teachers. It's particularly useful for teachers in their first year of teaching when everything is new. There's so much they have to learn and a lot of pressure on them to get up to speed very quickly. Having someone to turn to who they can talk to about bullying problems or any problem actually becomes very important. So mentors for teachers, mentors for students is an excellent way of keeping an eye on the principles of an anti-bullying program to make sure those principles are being turned into practice and there aren't too many lapses. Of course there will be lapses, but the important thing is to check them and send out the message that there's a better way of solving the problems, that we're not going to go down this track of having a bullying culture. The problem of lapses of behaviour, which children will have and teachers will have, also means that it's a good idea to have good supervision, particularly supervision in playgrounds and also in group work situations. It's just a matter of having someone there to remind everyone that conversation, communication, and activities should be cooperative. It should not involve domination and it should not involve hurting someone else. So playground supervision, even supervision to get children on buses to go home, even mentors walking children home from school. These are all important ways of extending and learning and consolidating that decision that a school makes to have a whole school approach that prevents bullying from occurring. it would be fair enough to ask me, how do you pick someone who is going to be a good bystander for intervention or a good mentor in a school? And there's no easy answer to that. But if the school adopts a whole school approach to bullying, there'll be a chance for everyone to express their views. So you will have some people who are cynical about the whole exercise. You'll have some people who are not really prepared to put their best foot forward. But if you attend those workshops and those meetings and you look out for someone who's good and you talk to others, talking to others can help enormously in finding out who will be a good person to have as a mentor and who can be relied on to be a bystander who will intervene. Often bystanders, programs that have bystander intervention talk about monitors. People are given a special status as someone who's watching out to make sure that children, particularly younger children, are not hurt by older children in the playground. So again, it comes down to communication. It comes down to respect. If some people don't want to take part, well, you can't make them and you shouldn't make them. And they may say they don't want to take part because they're not very good at it, in which case you don't really want them to be in there doing more harm than good. So it's about tolerance and respect, but encouraging people. Perhaps that's the most important thing, to encourage people and reward and appreciate people who are good at bystander intervention and who are good mentors. And principals can have an eye to that and can advise others, teachers and students, about who is a good person who can help in that situation. If we want to implement an anti-bullying program in schools, then of course leadership is important. The principal needs to understand the program and to be committed to the program. And in some sense, the principal does set the standards for the school. But when I talk about anti-bullying programs, I'm also saying that everyone has to be a leader for it to work. And that's why it's so important to have everyone meet, everyone take part in the plan, the implementation plan, and sign on to turning the school into an anti-bullying school. Parents, teachers, the principal, the administrative staff as well, of course, and the students. But let's think of the other situation, a situation where a principal does not really believe in an anti-bullying program, who really wants to enforce rules first and foremost, and who's probably fairly heavy-handed in dealing with staff. In this kind of situation, we can have a very negative outcome in that the principal who may be involved in bullying themselves, or at least be perceived to be bullying others, then sets the standard and passes on this bullying behaviour. So in other words, a principal can bully those below him or her, and then they in turn bully those further down the line. Of course, in this situation, we've got classic bully victim scenarios developing, and they are so difficult to resolve and have such serious health consequences for everyone in that particular institution and in that school. So in sum, it's very important that our principals are well trained. They understand what an anti-bullying program is, that they share the planning, that they include all participants, and they actually trust their staff and their students and their parents to be leaders, to know that things are going to go wrong sometimes, and to know that their job is going to be made more difficult when things go wrong, but to be ready and able to handle that situation when it emerges, not try to clamp down on any misdemeanour, if you like, and diversion from the path of the prescribed anti-bullying program. So in some sense, principals have to be pretty special people. It's a hard job for them, but one that is absolutely essential if our schools are going to be safe and rewarding places where teachers teach well and students learn well. So you might have been wondering why I mentioned teachers and the importance of teachers having mentors and how teachers can bully. Of course, they don't mean to. That's not their intention. They would never have gone into teaching if they thought they were going to turn into bullies. But we know from the workplace literature that there's a lot of stress on people in working environments these days. And I think that is the case in schools as well. So workplace bullying is not always the result of someone who is a dominating person. It can be the result of stress. It can be the result of change. It can be the result of people not knowing exactly what they're supposed to do. There can be ambiguity about their jobs. Who's doing this? Who's doing that? Throwing jobs on other people unexpectedly. All these kinds of things that happen in stressed workplaces can actually trigger bullying. People don't realise it, but they start talking in a very dominating and demanding way. And it may be that they do that to people who are less resilient than they expect. So in other words, other teachers may actually take that bullying, what they see as bullying, very badly. And of course, children are often very sensitive to that. Children want their teachers to think that they're trying hard, they're doing good work. And so they'll pick up on that kind of message from teachers and be quite intimidated by it, even though teachers aren't meaning to direct it to them. There are other ways, I think, that we should consider relieving our teachers of these sorts of triggers from bullying. It's fine to have them in courses to try to teach them to manage these things better, but we also need to look at the organisation of our schools. If we've got a stressful workplace, then we need organisational change to actually relieve some of that stress. And a really important thing for us to consider is just how much red tape teachers get tied up with these days, that makes them tired, that takes up time that they should be devoting to preparing lessons and teaching their students. Not preparing a lesson is really an invitation for bullying, particularly when you get to high school level. Students expect their teachers to be well prepared, and they detect any sign of weakness, and if teachers actually are poorly prepared and are defensive, then these are triggers for bullying situations to emerge. So what we can do for our teachers is not just offer anti-bullying programs, but also say to governments, do you really need all the information you're asking teachers to collect in schools? Of course, some documentation is important. It's important for planning, it's important for student well-being, and it's important for teacher well-being. But it's highly likely that there's an accumulation of collection of data, and a bit of culling would be a good thing for actually allowing teachers to get back to what they do best and what they want to do, which is to teach students. I haven't said a lot so far about the characteristics of bullies and victims, and there is a lot of literature to say that, yes, bullies do tend to be more aggressive, more impulsive. They enjoy the game, if you like, of being up while someone else is down, and they find that reinforcing and will keep doing it. And victims can be people who are a bit socially withdrawn, who find it difficult to stand up for themselves, who may be unsure of themselves. So there's no question that there is some evidence to say that bullies and victims find each other and do each other damage because of their personal characteristics. But having said that, there's also a lot of work to show that you can be quiet and withdrawn and not good at standing up for yourself, but never be the victim of a bully. And similarly, you can be dominant and aggressive and impulsive and never be a bully. So what we really do need to do is to look at the situations that trigger these events. And that's what we were trying to do in our research at the Australian National University. We were trying to find the situational triggers, the things that were going on in people's heads that made them escalate to a bullying event or be involved in a bullying event and be unable to calm it down. That's where the work on shame and pride became so important. And we thought that it should be possible to teach people to manage their shame well and to manage their pride well, and at the very least to become aware that if they manage shame poorly or manage their pride poorly, there could be consequences in the long term. The concept that we used was one that was developed by my colleague Nathan Harris, and we call this ethical identity. And that's that part of ourselves in which I guess we're quite proud. The things that we know we do well, the things that we'd like to do well, what we expect of ourselves in terms of our competence and our performance. But ethical identity also includes the kind of person we think we are, whether we think we're a moral person, whether we think we're a good person. And so when we don't perform to our standards, when we don't do as well as we think we should at a task, or when we fail to live up to our sense of being a good person, then what we feel is a sense of shame. Now, you might all shudder at that point because, yes, shame is not a pleasant emotion. It's the emotion we have when we just want to hide and we don't want to see anyone and we don't want to talk to anyone about what's happened. But in fact, it's an incredibly important emotion for us to regulate ourselves socially. When we feel a bit of a shame, we know that we're not doing that well. It's our feedback to say, take stock, try harder, or try again to do what we think we should be doing. So people without shame actually have a great deal of difficulty fitting in to society. So if shame's a good thing, and I'm saying it's a good thing, well, why do so many of you sit there and think to yourself, it's horrible, I don't like shame, and I don't like others to feel shame? Well, what you're really thinking about is something that Eliza Ahmed calls shame management. And Eliza says that we can manage our shame well and constructively, or we can manage our shame badly. When we manage our shame well, we acknowledge the shame. We think, oh, we've gone off track here, better get on track. We apologise, we make amends, we try to make things right to the best of our ability. Our whole sense of being and purpose is focusing on getting things back on track. But if we don't manage our shame well, Eliza argues that we tend to displace shame. We blame other people for our situation. We pretend we don't feel the shame, and so we continue to have that horrible feeling in the pit of our stomach that stops us from doing things. Now, what we found in our research is that those who bully and persistently bully are less likely to be able to acknowledge shame, and they're more likely to displace shame. In other words, they don't manage their shame at all well. And they hit out when they actually come across people who think they should be acknowledging shame. And we often find, particularly in children, that those who are victimised by bullies are children who have quite strong moral views and think that bullies are doing the wrong thing and should acknowledge shame. So you can see how we have this coming together of two very different ways of managing shame, and how this can really ignite into a difficult and aggressive kind of situation. So much of our work has been about trying to convince teachers that an incredibly important part of their teaching curriculum should be to help children manage their emotions, to teach them to say, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, it's okay to admit to having done something that's wrong, and that's far better than hitting out and hurting someone, to get rid of that sense of shame, to discharge that shame or to cover that shame up. These findings with children in schools with these varying capacities to manage shame has led us to talk about creating safe space in schools, places where children feel able to talk about what's happening, to be open. In other words, the qualities of the whole school approach that I was talking about earlier to prevent bullying really is about setting up safe space for children with open, and teachers, where there is open communication, where there is respectful communication, and problems can be shared and solved collectively. Now, we've also done some work on pride. Most of the work we've done on pride has occurred with adults. It's occurred in workplaces. And we have found a very interesting set of findings there. Again, this comes from the work of Eliza Ahmed. And Eliza made a distinction between what she called narcissistic pride and humble pride. Now, as you know, pride is that feeling that we have when we do something well, that sense of living up to our ethical identity, if you like. But how we actually manage pride varies, just as how we manage shame varies. We can manage our pride through feeling a deep sense of satisfaction with what we've done, and through realizing that others have helped us, through, if you like, sharing that pride with others. But we can also use that pride to belittle others. We can use it to make others feel less adequate. We can use it to say, we're better than you, if you like. Narcissistic pride refers to vaunting pride, the kind of pride which is used to make other people feel that they are inadequate, that they've failed, that you're better than they are. And of course, we see narcissistic pride very often in highly competitive workplaces. And people are told that they have to boast about their achievements to get ahead of others. So there are workplaces that encourage this kind of narcissistic pride. Now, what we found was that where there was narcissistic pride, there was also bullying. Those who displayed narcissistic pride were also more likely to bully others. And those who displayed humble pride were less likely to bullying others. So this gave us some insight into what we meant by having safe space in schools at a very practical level. It was not only fostering cooperation and ensuring people spoke to each other respectfully, it also meant that we shouldn't encourage displays of narcissistic pride. It was far more important to display the forms of humble pride that everyone could share in, and where we could be pleased for the success that others are experiencing. Often in work situations and in classroom situations, the thing that we notice if we're in charge of a group or we're responsible for what's happening are the noisy people, the ones making most noise, who are drawing most attention to themselves. And we often don't take notice of the quieter ones. They may be quiet achievers who just want to be left alone, but they may also be people who are struggling in some ways. And I think that in the hustle and bustle with performance indicators and having to get things done on time, we often don't see those who may be struggling, who just need a quiet word or someone to ask if they are okay. So to summarise what we're doing here, our work looked at shame management with children, We looked at pride management with adults. And we have brought that work together to say that whole school approaches to bullying need to take account of both. There needs to be a philosophy that encourages respectful treatment of each other, open communication, to create safe space to talk about problems. But we also need a healthy way of managing our pride. We need to be able to share pride and not encourage this narcissistic form of pride where one person's advantage is used to denigrate another person. And that's at the heart of poor pride management that we often find in highly competitive workplaces. We think that what happens is that when you bring poor shame management and poor pride management together, you have a climate, a culture, if you like, that's ready to ignite with bullying events and to end very badly. And the reason for that is that if shame is being managed poorly, if people feel they're not living up to their potential or being recognised for doing what they do well, they're more likely to displace shame. At the same time, those who are having success are using that success to make others feel bad, make others feel inadequate, and to, if you like, climb the ladder of success in their organisation. These two things mean that we've got a culture where people are not relaxed, they're not enjoying being together, they're not working productively together, and there'll be all sorts of a sense of injustice and a sense of things not being right that actually will trigger bullying events and accusations of bullying. And sometimes we also need to realise that in these climates, the accusations of bullying are not really fair or valid. It can be a sign of jealousy or someone being criticised for poor performance and acting out their shame in this very negative way. So in other words, the culture, the whole school culture, is very, very important, and that comes down to senior managers setting a good example and being very diligent about appreciating the positives of all of their staff. That doesn't mean not recognising and dealing with the harm that's done or the negatives in an organisation. That always is going to be there and it always needs to be managed. But it's very important not just to focus on the negatives, to also focus on the positives and find good things to say about what people are doing well, whether they be teachers or students or parents. They all need a bit of encouragement to work well together and to create this climate where bullying is unlikely to occur. And when it does occur, all the ducks are lined up to handle it intelligently and well and with minimum harm. One of the important relationships that has emerged in the literature in recent years is the link between what's happening in the family and what's happening at school. And it is the case that some children are more prone to being bullies because of the way things are done at home. If there's a bit of a bullying dominating culture at home, then children are more likely to try that at school. But the other really interesting finding is that children who do not have boundaries set for them and where their parents always make excuses for their poor behaviour or their bad behaviour, such children are more likely to be bullies. And the reason we think for that is that such children have never learned to manage shame well. Because their parents make excuses for them, they don't ever have the experience of learning to acknowledge shame. They, like their parents, displace their shame. And that puts them in a situation at school where they're confronted with not doing things as well as they'd like. They may not be as clever as they want to be. They may not be as good at sport as they want to be. Or they may be get into trouble for doing something that they shouldn't do from their teacher. But their way of managing that is not to acknowledge the shame and think, oh, I didn't do so well, I'll try harder, or I'll get someone to help me do this better. Instead, they displace their shame. They become aggressive. They pick on someone else. They dominate someone else. They try to be a winner in a game of one up, one down. And that's the way they cope with their feelings that they're not doing things as well as they should. So that's also why it's very important to include parents in a whole school approach, that parents need to realise that sometimes they do have to call their children to account and not always be making excuses for them. And that becomes much easier to do if the school has an open policy of talking through problems, of working with parents, rather than immediately sanctioning a child, suspending a child, for instance, or worse still, expelling a child. When we started our work at ANU, we surveyed young children and asked them about their bullying experiences. And we learnt something very important, and that is that what upsets people, often to an outsider, seems trivial. So when we asked children to write down the things that they were bullied about and that they were upset about, we had things like the kids say, I smell, or the kids tease me about my teeth, or the kids tease me because I have red hair. And it's very easy to read that and have a little chuckle to yourself, because that kind of bullying is in all the storybooks, and you think it's little stuff. But in fact, to those children, it was really important, and it was something that really affected how happy and well-adjusted they were at school. So the lesson is never trivialise what someone says is upsetting them. Respect the thing that is disturbing them, and it may not be something that you imagined. That's why it's so important to talk to people about bullying and how people are feeling about it and what is at the heart of the bullying experience. We've talked a lot about one-on-one bullying. It takes many different forms. Both girls and boys bully. It happens at all age groups. And of course, the form that it takes will change over time. The literature, certainly the early literature, showed that boys were far more likely to be threatening physically and verbally in their bullying, and girls were more likely to gossip and engage in social exclusion, leave people out, and inflict damage that way. But we can't really have a list of all the things that amount to bullying, because it's all about how you perceive it and how it affects that thing that I call ethical identity, that sense of yourself as a worthwhile person. We should also realise that bullying is not just about individuals. You can have groups who bully, and perhaps that's one of the most challenging things for a school principal, when the bullying is not done by one person, but it's done by a group of kids who form a kind of gang. And we do know that these sorts of bullying events that involve groups can be related to ethnic groups, that the kids of a particular nationality can actually become victims of other groups. So when we see things like the Cronulla riots, and we see nationalism, Australian nationalism, or if you like, white supremacy rearing its ugly head, then we can be fairly sure that associated with that is probably some serious bullying going on in the schools, where other minority groups are being stigmatised and bothered in a serious way. That's a hard one to solve. But again, community becomes important. It's another example that we don't solve this by not talking about it. We don't solve it by closing down communication channels. We open up those communication channels. We bring in people from the community that can help resolve those differences between, and the tensions, the ethnic tensions that may exist in a school. And it's ludicrous to think that a principal can do that alone. The principal needs the whole community and people from those particular groups to settle things down and to get a more civil way of engagement occurring in those schools. One of the most troubling things about bullying, whether it's children or it's adults, is that often the person being bullied doesn't talk about it, nor does the bully, for that matter. In these situations, families and relatives and friends often feel quite desperate when they realise what's happening, or they see signs of poor performance or lack of interest or anxiety or depression, and they don't know why. And then if they do find out, they wonder how they could have missed it and what they could do about it. I think the only way that we can address this is, again, in the school, encouraging people to talk about bullying, this practice of keeping it secret, which is what we do when we feel shame and we can't resolve our shame, is so very dangerous for everyone. So it's a matter of schools taking the lead and encouraging teachers and children to talk about their bullying experiences. It may not even be serious bullying. It might be more what I called soft bullying at the beginning of this talk, but just opening up about it and sharing how they felt about it becomes an important way of just taking the stigma, if you like, out of both being a bully and being the victim of bullying. That's what we need to do, because at the moment it's a stigmatized state. Bullies feel as if they're evil people, and victims feel that they're not strong people, they're weak people. And the stigma of both those labels is not something that we need, and the stigma is damaging to everyone, including families. It's not always the case that you're not telling. I think often it is. Often it's because of the shame and the feeling that you're not coping, and you should be able to look after yourself, and if you're a big person you could look after yourself. So that's part of the problem, but I don't think it's always the whole problem. I think we can just become down on ourselves and then become less resilient, and eventually we'll notice that someone's picking on us and giving us a hard time. But those two things come together as sort of a loss of psychological resiliency, if you like, along with a recognition that someone is making our lives miserable and we want it to stop. And the evidence shows that there are times in our lives when we are less resilient, and therefore we are more vulnerable to the adverse effects of bullying than others. There are two approaches that are being used in schools that underpin many of the effective programs that are available, the anti-bullying programs that you can read about in the literature. One of those approaches is called restorative justice, or sometimes called restorative practices. And the idea with a restorative approach to bullying is that everyone who's affected comes together to talk about the problem. Now that's interesting, because you will see that in the workplace bullying literature, or you will know from your own experience, that often when a bullying incident is reported, no one's allowed to talk to anyone. Everyone's sent home. And if they're not sent home, they're put in a corner so they don't do further harm, and they can't really share their experiences. Now, from what I've just been saying about the problems of poor shame management and poor pride management, you can see that that's not always psychologically the best way to deal with these issues. As I said at the beginning, bullying is a relational problem, it's a social problem. And if you stop people from talking about their bullying to anyone, to those that can support them, to those that can help make sense of what's happened to them, then you're really doing them a disservice. And yet that's what happens in many of our workplaces. So a restorative approach is quite different. There's a skilled facilitator who brings everyone together. There's lots of planning that goes into these meetings, by the way. It's not a case where bully and victim just meet each other cold. A lot of planning goes into it. But bullies and victims and their families, those affected, because families are often seriously affected by these events, families and workmates that can be supportive and can help work towards a solution, are brought into a circle. And in this safe space where there are rules about how everyone engages with each other, the problem is talked through. The victim gets a chance to explain how they've been hurt and why they were hurt. The bully gets a chance to explain what was going on in their heads, why they acted the way they did. And together they work out how this event has caused so much damage and how they might move on in the future. Now, it doesn't always have a happy ending. We know, for instance, in serious bullying cases that eventually a person, one of the people at least, is likely to leave that organisation. That's why bullying is quite costly. Bullying in an organisation means that there can be higher turnover than an organisation ideally wants. But nevertheless, what's very important in a restorative justice approach is that a solution or an understanding is developed together. A number of people know about what's happened and they can talk about it later, they can provide support. And the central idea is that from that point, healing can begin for those involved. And given how terrible the long-term consequences can be of bullying, we do want that healing to start as quickly as possible. Now, the other approach, and one that I think that we need to take seriously, is a literature that says it's important to have rules. It's important to have rules against bullying, and it's important to enforce those rules, to set limits, if you like, and not to simply nag and say, no, we don't do that here, we don't do that here, we don't do that here. The approach that we took, the way that we take that problem, that nagging problem on board, is to say that we need a responsive regulatory approach. So in a responsive regulatory approach, we always start out with the assumption that the bullying may be accidental, that there are reasons for it, and let's try to explore those fully. But if we don't get anywhere with that approach, if we find that someone is having great difficulty controlling their anger or aggression, then we do have to use more interventionist steps to prevent them from doing harm. So, in other words, some of those rules that involve giving children time out, even suspending them from school, not too soon, but even having school suspensions, they're important for signalling to children and to teachers and to parents that bullying will not be tolerated in the school. The problem, unfortunately, at the moment is that too often those rules are enforced before other things are trialled. But we do know from our work with teachers that teachers are willing and would much prefer those other courses of action to be followed. They see punishment as the tool of last resort, not the tool of first resort. One of the reasons it can be difficult for schools to resolve bullying experiences is that the bullying can take place outside the school completely. It can take place going home from school. It can also occur on the internet. And when it occurs on the internet, power differentials don't matter so much. You don't have big kids and little kids. You just have kids who are all equal in the harm they can do to each other on the internet. And also, of course, things can go viral very easily. So there's no sense of containment of a bullying incident when you have bullying occurring on the internet. Now, for schools to understand that, to get to the bottom of it, is extremely difficult. And so that's why it's sometimes better to bring people together in a restorative justice circle, and rather than try to find someone to blame or an instigator, focus on the harm that's being caused, realize that everyone has probably contributed to that harm, and then try to find a way forward so that everyone can heal. I think if we concentrate too much on the past, I'm not saying that we don't uncover the harm that's been done in the past, that's very important, but the details can become so murky and the injustices are so rife, so many injustices have occurred that we can't adjudicate all of those events. What we need to do is focus on who's hurting now and what they need to go forward and move on with their lives. For new teachers, it's true that in their responding to things, they can't be agents of change themselves at that point. But my message to new teachers would be that if you can understand the situation you're in, you're better equipped to endure it, and it will get better. But the most important thing, I think, for new teachers is not to allow themselves to become cut off and isolated, not to let those feelings of I'm not doing this as well as I should, the students don't think I'm as good as I should be, lead them to withdraw. Find someone and ask them to be your mentor. You're not expected to be the perfect teacher the first year you are out there. Find some help, and in most schools there are more experienced teachers who are willing to show you the ropes and help you through them. I think that the many things that new teachers have to learn to do, getting used to the administration, teaching the class, managing behavioural problems, knowing how to intervene in the playground, just knowing how to negotiate things with the principal and the administration. These are all difficult and can turn an ordinary day into a very bad day. But if new teachers think to themselves, well, I'm not going to let my feelings of shame get me down, I'm going to get in there and talk to people and find out how to do this better, then the hard part will be quickly behind them. It takes longer to get over the hard part when you keep it all to yourself and just keep thinking that you should be able to manage all these difficulties that you're facing. And of course, some people have an easier run than others. You don't often get to choose which class you're given when you're a new teacher. And it's not unusual for new teachers to be given difficult classes that others don't want. So in those situations, put your hand up and ask for help. And hopefully it will pass. And we won't lose you from the profession of teaching because we dearly need you there.